resolution, and we welcome our Democrat colleagues to join us at our press conference here in 5 minutes. 5-minute vote. All right, let me do this and make this official. The committee will come to order, and we will proceed with the question, are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady from Minnesota has an amendment, and we are on number 11. So, Clerk, if you'll read that out, please, we will take a few seconds and distribute the copies of the amendment.
Amendment number 11 on economic security programs offered by Ms. Omar.
Ms. Omar, you have 4 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. My amendment will restore the 2024 appropriation funding to the funding levels agreed to in the Fiscal Responsibility Act, protecting vital economic security programs. This budget resolution would lead to dangerous cuts for social safety programming that millions of our constituents rely on to meet their basic needs. Mandatory spending for income security programs, including SNAP and TANF, would be slashed by nearly $1 trillion under this budget framework. The Women, Infant, and Children program, which provides nutrition assistance to 5 million women and children, would be cut by $800 million. House Republicans would also cripple new affordable housing development under this proposal. Funding for home investment partnership programs would be cut by nearly 70%, resulting in 20,000 view homes being constructed or renovated in communities across the country. These cuts would increase housing costs further by eliminating funding for housing choice vouchers for 20,000 households, including approximately 6,000 households headed by seniors. The added cruelty of these implicit cuts is the timing. The United States is grappling with the rising food insecurity and poverty rates as the positive impacts of past economic support, like the enhanced child tax credit, have faded. We are also dealing with affordable housing shortage. This is only getting worse in this high interest rate environment. And yet Republicans are determined to force deep cuts to programs that help keep people fed and safely housed right before the winter during these hunger and housing crises. My amendment would ensure that Congress does not leave countless Americans out in the cold without enough food to feed their families. If you care about your constituents' livelihoods and well-being, you should vote for this amendment.
I thank the gentlelady and would now open up the floor for anyone who would like to take time to oppose the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I request time.
I yield to the gentleman from Michigan, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's start with a question. Which government programs create individual and family confidence and resilience? Now let's get to reality. For generations, Americans have prized the values of hard work and self-sufficiency, and prospects for upward mobility have long encouraged people of all backgrounds to move up the economic ladder. However, rather than embracing these ideals, our nation's welfare programs continue to trap Americans in a perpetual state of dependency on government assistance. These programs are allowing too many able-bodied adults to sit at home, resulting in major workforce shortages and driving costs up for businesses, which are then passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. And the cycle starts anew. As a nation, we must break this cycle and return our welfare system to its original purpose as a temporary, I repeat, temporary safety net for those truly in need, not a final destination for able-bodied Americans who refuse to work. This is not a controversial idea. In fact, in 1996, then Senator Biden justified his own vote for bipartisan welfare reform, which included work requirements to incentivize employment and reduce welfare caseloads. Biden said then, quote, "The culture of welfare must be replaced with the culture of work. The culture of dependence must be replaced with the culture of self-sufficiency and personal responsibility. I don't agree with the president on much, but that's very well stated. I hope he wrote it. As described in a recent piece by the American Enterprise Institute, work requirements are, quote, an effective anti-poverty tool, especially in light of the evidence that they actually increase employment and raise income for families. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the AEI article into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. This amendment undermines our efforts for fiscal responsibility while promoting dependency. I repeat, individual and family dependency on government rather than empowering Americans through the opportunity. So again, let's end with a question on my part here. Tell me government programs that actually create the environment of a hand up, not a hand out. And I'll support that any day. And with that, I yield to my colleague, Congressman Klein.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I want to emphasize that this budget provides more than $9 trillion in funding for low-income programs over the next decade. And we can talk about these programs. We can talk about the amendment from the gentlelady to add almost $1 trillion more. But let's talk about what the impact of this spending actually would do and has done to inflationary costs and to costs of housing. And the gentlelady talked about affordable housing crisis. We have affordable housing problems in my district as well. And I go to my builders and I ask them, why are we having problems? What are your main drivers of your costs when you build houses? And what they say are the environmental regulations that were just tacked on last year. That you have the Green New Deal that was just passed under the guise of the Inflation Reduction Act and did nothing to reduce inflation, but it sure did a lot to increase the cost of housing. And so, I would say that we could do more to address the affordable housing crisis by reducing regulations on small businesses, home builders, and other small businesses that would actually help to bring down the cost of housing and help those in our communities who are facing affordable housing crises. So this amendment would simply continue to fuel that inflationary fire that has raised the cost of housing, raised the cost of building affordable housing, and actually run contrary to the aim of the gentlelady's amendment. So I would oppose the amendment, and with that, I yield back.
Using the balance of your time here, I just want to say I haven't met a member of Congress on either side that doesn't want to help people who are struggling. They're working hard and still having a tough time making ends meet. We can argue about making ways to make it more efficient, ways to get the states involved, ways to make the programs more cost effective. But at the end of the day, I think at a base level, and there's requirement issues, there are benefit issues, there are other things related to means-tested welfare. But I think we have to start. We've got a job participation rate that's the lowest, not the lowest, but I think it's the lowest in about 25 years. We need to restore the dignity of work and the work ethic in this country, not just because it's a fiscal matter, because it's good for people to use their God-given talents to contribute to our great country. With that, I'm going to yield 1 minute for final comments from the gentlelady from Minnesota.
I believe the people of this country are dignified people. No one stands in line to get food unless they need it. No one goes through the rigorous humiliation that it takes for you to apply for welfare programs. Dignity is within people. What we are talking about is the work that we have to do here in government to try to support those who need it. I also know that there are countless members on this committee and in Congress who have had the support of government programs who are now wealthy and well off. So the idea that because somebody is on a government program, that they are going to stay on a government program forever is not something that exists. There are many countries around the world who provide government assistance where people are not constantly on welfare. We have to provide the bootstraps if we are saying people need to pull themselves up.
Thank you. If
Yeah,
I may,
please.
gentlemen, yield, because we're obviously running way ahead of schedule and have done this sparingly throughout. So now it really needs to be good, right? I just want to respond to something that the chairman said, because I sincerely disagree with the comment that we need to restore the American people's work ethic. I think we can cheer the fact, and there is data after data that shows this, we have the most productive workforce in the world today. We can also cheer the fact that there are more Americans of a working age, or excuse me, a higher percentage of working age Americans in the workforce today than at any point since 1999. That, quote, great resignation storyline that you would read about a couple of years ago is as out of date as 4-year-old milk. The reality is what has built this country is the American work ethic. And those that have this perception that there's this group of people out there just sitting on their couch watching Jerry Springer all day, and that they're collecting a huge amount of money and that's what's blowing up the deficit and debt, it just isn't so. I can tell you from a perspective of a working class district in Philadelphia, almost everyone I know works hard and comes from a working family. That is the reality of America today. So to the best we can, let's defeat any sort of negative caricatures about the work ethic of the American people.
The gentleman yield.
We've got some time. Go ahead, Mr.
I just
Klein.
wanted to ask the gentleman from Philadelphia, wouldn't he agree that the workforce participation rate over the last 20 years, not the last 2 since COVID, but the last 20, has been steadily decreasing?
Yeah, so I thought the gentleman was going to make a much more of a smart aleck remark than his sincere and good question, given our sports bantering that typically goes on. Actually, Mark Zandy, when he was here testifying in our committee, spoke to that. Over the last 25 years, our worker participation rate through Democratic and Republican presidencies has declined. He said most of that is explained, though, by also the aging of our population. Even more worrying, though, over the next generation, as the graying of our population continues, that is all. Excuse me. That is also supposed to continue. So again, though, let's just make sure we're not mixing apples and oranges. We do have a population that is getting older, and a higher percentage of Americans will be out of the workforce due to older age.
Some of us are graying faster than others.
Sorry.
Last comment on this. In my district, I can't imagine it's any different than anyone else's. There are people that need it, probably desperately need it, and but for the grace go I. And when they need it, we need to make sure it's working and that the people who need it have those resources. But I will tell you, in my district, there are a number of people that abuse the system. And I hear it from businesses, I hear it from other community leaders who say there are people who take advantage of the system. And I don't understand. I don't think we need to cast aspersion on everybody that's on welfare. We should, like you said, champion and cheer on everybody to be the best that their God-given potential allows. But why not put just a common sense, quality control, guardrail, whatever you want to call it, to say if you're able to work, you should. That, I just don't understand why we couldn't agree on that. And then just say, whether it's 2% or 20%, it shouldn't happen. It's not right for the person and their family, and it's not right for the taxpayer. That I get. I don't think anybody's saying everybody that's on welfare is abusing that system and not working when they can. So anyway, with that, let's go ahead and call the question. Questions on agreeing on the amendment from Ms. Omar. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. If you'd like a roll call, we'll do it later before the end of the markup.
Yes.
Okay.
Request a report of it.
Okay, request granted. Any other questions? I think we have a few more amendments.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Scott Peters.
I have an amendment to desk.
Mr. Peters has an amendment. If the clerk will read that out, I believe that is amendment.
Amendment number 7 on infrastructure offered by Mr. Peters.
I'd like to yield 4 minutes to my friend from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, my amendment, would prevent the cuts that the majority is pushing for particularly to reductions programs critical for our nation's infrastructure. The amendment stops the threat of a government shutdown by restoring 2024 appropriations to the funding levels we agreed to in the Fiscal Responsibility Act just earlier this year. Investing in infrastructure is not just about fixing roads and bridges, it's about building healthy communities. And the budget resolution before us would cut infrastructure funding for vital projects in my district and across America. And I want to talk about one today in San Diego that I'm particularly concerned about. We have a dangerous and critical health crisis plaguing the San Diego region. This is the raw sewage spilling into Tijuana River Valley, polluting our beaches and neighborhoods. The South Bay International Wastewater Treatment Plant is a critical facility. It's a United States facility managed by the U.S. International Boundary and Water Commission under the Department of State. Under an international treaty, by the way, Mexico pays the U.S. to treat sewage originating in Baja California. This is overflow that discharges into the Pacific Ocean and flows upward onto San Diego shores. This is a plant we built in the 1990s under bipartisan agreement with federal money. But today, the contaminated water contains raw sewage, industrial waste, trash, and even toxic chemicals. And currently, the plant's infrastructure remains exactly the same as it was when it was first constructed in 1997. Expansion of this plant is crucial to process the increased waste from Tijuana, whose population has grown by more than 1 million people since the plant was built. So we've been working on this. In 2020, the congressional delegation from San Diego and our senators, working with the Trump administration, secured $300 million associated with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement to expand the plant's ability to treat wastewater from 25 million gallons a day to 50 million gallons a day. However, in June, IBWC, the federal government, informed the public that the treatment plant is in such bad shape from not being kept up over time through regular appropriations for infrastructure that we need to rehabilitate the plant before we can expand it. The effect of this is really remarkable, that we have raw sewage washing up on the shores of Imperial Beach, which is a community represented by Mr. Vargas. And as that dries, people are breathing fecal matter. The beaches in Coronado have been closed for 2 straight summers, year-round, because it's unhealthy. Meanwhile, we have Navy SEALs training in that water, telling us that they are swimming into pieces of feces that are coming out of this. This is a failure to invest in American infrastructure. This is a piece of American infrastructure that has seen years of underinvestment in construction and maintenance. It's left it in dire need of emergency repairs and expansion to treat untreated flows. This budget proposal and a possible shutdown would only make fixing things like this in San Diego and across the country that much tougher. The status quo in San Diego is unsustainable. It's unacceptable. We need help now, not cuts. We need action, not budget brinksmanship, and we need it now. The way to deal with this over time, I think, as I've talked about with the chairman and other members of this committee, is to get a fiscal commission to get ourselves in line, both for all kinds of spending, and that's going to be a hard look at the budget. It's also going to be a hard look at our tax policy. But a budget needs to invest in America's success. This budget resolution and shutdowns interrupt the tourism and travel sectors, squeeze small businesses, leave behind communities, and put people at risk in places like San Diego, where we're confronting problems that we cannot solve on our own, like cross-border sewage that is literally sickening our community from a plant owned and operated by the United States of America. We got to get this right. This has got to stop. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank my friend from California. Now open it up for any member who'd like to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Yakum, I yield to you, Mr. Representative from Indiana, 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit the Government Accountability Office's report to congressional committees high-risk series, funding the nation's surface transportation, into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Currently, the CBO projects that the Highway Trust Fund will reach insolvency by 2028. Our budget resolution provides a deficit-neutral solution to the Highway Trust Fund by aligning the trust fund's spending with its incoming revenues. This is a logical step, as it will create fiscal stability, financial stability within the trust fund and eliminate its terrible track record of being bailed out by the American taxpayers. The original design of the trust fund made it so that individuals who utilize our highways the most would help support this fund through taxes on gasoline, tires, and other automotive-related expenses. However, these user fees have lost their effectiveness over time, putting the general fund on the hook supporting the trust fund. The GAO estimates that from 2008 to 2021, the Highway Trust Fund received over $270 billion in taxpayer bailouts. These types of government bailouts need to stop. It's essential that we keep investing in our nation's infrastructure, but in a financially responsible way, which is why the budget resolution we have put forward today includes a deficit-neutral reserve fund for investments in our national infrastructure. When we look towards the future investment into our nation's infrastructure, we need to ensure that it's done in a fiscally responsible manner so it does not compound our debt. When we look back at IJA, congressional Democrats argued that IJA would be paid for through $589 billion in offsets over the next 10 years. However, the CBO's current calculations estimate pay-fors only accounted for $180 billion, leaving an additional $400 billion shortfall. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment, and I would like to yield the balance of my time to my esteemed colleague and friend from Georgia, Mr. Drew Ferguson.
I thank the gentleman from Indiana and from a dear friend from California. Having a waste treatment plant in that sort of disrepair is absolutely horrible. I've been a mayor. I've had to deal with such things. I understand what you're going through. But I think one of the things that I would ask first on that is, how much has California and San Diego contributed to that or not contributed to that? I don't know the answer to it. But when I look at this and look at the spending and the choices that we're having to make right now, we can't do that kind of project and pay for $6.4 billion of carbon reduction programs, $1 billion for Reconnecting Communities pilot program, $2.5 billion for charging and fueling stations for electric cars, another $5 billion National Electric Formula Program, $10 million for total energy efficient building technologies, $5 billion at the EPA for God knows what, and another $5.6 billion at the Department of Transportation for low or no emission bus projects. My point is, we as Americans are going to have to make choices about what we can and can't do. And building electric charging stations across this nation doesn't seem to be as high a priority as fixing a sewer plant in San Diego. So I just think that what this budget does is it does highlight that we are now as Americans having to make some choices. We're going to have to make hard decisions. We're going to have to look at things, and we're going to have to ask ourselves, what's it worth borrowing money for that we have to do right now? And I just think that's the position that we're in. So I think this is, I would urge a no vote on this. I think America has got to make some decisions about either having meaningful infrastructure projects that the country needs right now, such as a waste treatment plant, or the Green New Deal. With that, I yield back.
Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you, gentlemen.
Ferguson. Mr. Chairman, I do yield back the
I
balance.
thank both gentlemen. Both gentlemen. Been a long day. 1 minute to close to the representative from California.
I understand. I really respect the gentleman from Georgia, and I thought he stated his concern well. I wish I'd seen Congress able to do that. I think maybe one thing to think about in terms of our long-term approach is a commission, like that's been referred to in this committee and some other places, to get us on the right track. But I don't think that this fits and starts approach, where we have an agreement during the year that we don't live up to, is really serving us well. And I think it's going to hurt a lot of folks, like it does in San Diego. So I'd urge support for the amendment. And Mr. Chairman, again, thank you for having the hearing.
I thank my friend from California. Let's call the question on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Peters. All those in favor say aye. All those no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Would you like a You bet. Pursuant to our agreement, we'll postpone the recorded vote until later in the markup. Are there any other amendments at the desk? Mr. Trone?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Ranking Member Boyle. This budget process is about setting our priorities as a nation and determining the resources we need to meet our goals, ensure every American has a fair chance to succeed. As members of the committee, we have a duty to deliver a budget resolution that makes good on that promise. Yet, we're here today to consider a budget resolution 10 days before the end of the fiscal year, a budget we should have worked on 6 months ago. We're barreling toward a government shutdown because Republicans reneged on the bipartisan budget deal they voted in June. We're trying to deliver on campaign, and they're trying to deliver on campaign promises to cut everything but defense. In this extreme Republican budget, in my home state of Maryland, 600 kids will be cut from Head Start. 4,400 teachers will be kicked out of the classroom due to the budget cuts. Is this really our vision of America? They say they want to decrease the national debt. Who doesn't? But in reality, Republicans are engaged in an insidious cycle of starving our government of resources, complaining government doesn't work, and then cutting some more. That doesn't sound like a winning formula. Well, as the biggest job creator on this committee, here's the truth about investment. Debt is an instrument in your business. It's an instrument in your idea, your people. It's about thinking long term. When I started my business, I took on debt. I believed in my product, my team, and those investments helped us expand into new markets, hire more people to support their families. The investment decisions we make in this room can be the difference between stagnation and innovation. That's why I'm introducing an amendment that would restore critical funding to scientific research and exploration. It prevents the dangerous cuts envisioned by the extreme MAGA House Republicans, particularly reductions in scientific research. Who wants to cut science? Good Lord. And technological advancement. Instead of stripping resources from agencies such as NASA and NSF, we need to drive our country forward and compete in the 21st century. Now more than ever, we're making stunning advances in space exploration, such as NASA's Lunar Surface Electromagnetics Experiment Night Instrument, set to explore the far side of the moon. These scientific advancements take vision and a confidence in our best and brightest, a vision our country that this resolution sorely lacks. I oppose this budget resolution and urge my colleagues to adopt this amendment to support American research and development. I hope my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are willing to deliver actual solutions if they want to balance the budget rather than this charade. I yield the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman from Maryland and now open it up for any member who'd like to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I request to be recognized.
I yield 5 minutes to my friend, or 4 minutes rather, Mr. Good from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the remarks by Mr. Trone, but despite his impressive business experience and success, if he ran his business and spent money and borrowed money the way the federal government does, he would have been out of business and wouldn't have had the success that he's had. This federal government spends 130% of its GDP, or gross domestic product. That would be like, our debt is 130% of our GDP. That would be like having debt that was 130% of your sales, not your income, but your sales. We'll spend some over $20,000 a citizen this year, over $20,000 a citizen at nearly $7 trillion. Only 15% of that, about $3,000, are on what should be the priority of the federal government. Could you imagine a business that only 15% of what it spent its money on had anything to do with the real priority of the business was? So we'll spend $3,000 trying to keep the nation safe and secure, which is the number one responsibility of the federal government. I suppose my friends on the other side do not agree with that, and they believe that it's the responsibility of the government to be the nanny state, to provide for and to take care of the citizens, if you will. We believe the number one responsibility of the federal government is to provide for the safety and security, and including securing and protecting our constitutionally protected rights that we believe are God-given rights. So we'll spend $20,000 per citizen this year, borrowing $6,000 of that. Borrowing $6,000 of that for every citizen, not for every taxpayer or even every household, but every citizen. We have, again, $33 trillion in national debt, which represents right at $100,000 per 330 million Americans. And what do we have to show for that? When you spend and invest in your business, you have something to show for that. What does the average citizen have to show for his or her share of $100,000 of that debt? Now, we were talking specifically about research and development investment, and the federal government, I think we all agree, and this budget reflects, does place a value on that, an appropriate value on that. However, it should be limited to that which only the federal government can do, or only that which the federal government should do, for which there is not the sufficient private incentive to do so. This budget understands the importance of ensuring the United States remains the world's leader in science and technology. This is not an easy task, as we face enormous budget challenges, as I've just mentioned, and increased global competition, specifically from China. I would like my friends on the other side to recognize the threat from China. They are not a competitive partner, as this administration seems to think. They are an existential adversary. But this budget recognizes that challenge and recognizes that communist leadership in China understands the advantages gained by being the global leader in science and innovation, is determined to surpass the United States in critical technologies. Mr. Chairman, I would like to request unanimous consent to submit the fiscal year 2024 views and estimates letter from the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would also just use as an example of private versus public, or private enterprise versus the taxpayer and the federal government. In 2022, there were a total of 78 successful orbital launches in the U.S., outpacing every other spacefaring nation on Earth. Companies like Rocket Lab, Blue Origin, ULA, and SpaceX are leaps and bounds ahead of government-funded and operated programs in nations like Russia and the aforementioned China. This commercial innovation is what this budget encourages, facilitates, and fosters. And Mr. Chairman, I would also like request unanimous consent to submit a data repository from the Center for Strategic and International Studies titled Space Environment Total Launches by Country into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm thankful this budget recognizes the premium of the private sector and private investment and private enterprise, and encourages and facilitates that accordingly. And I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Virginia, and now yield to Mr. Trone from Maryland for the last word, and we yield 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Good, for that. We certainly support the safety and security of our country. We're all in. And we certainly support private efforts in space exploration. They've been outstanding, and we hope they continue. But if my colleagues knew what they were doing, we should have done this in March. You pretend to be fiscally responsible. We head to a shutdown. In 2013, the shutdown cost the government $2 billion. We'll never get that back. It's in our debt. $2 billion. You put it there. If you want to be fiscally responsible, get your caucus to pass a continuing resolution. As a former businessman, I know when you believe in something, you invest in it. If we don't invest in research and development, we lose to China every day. We lose. You made my point for me. We lose to China. Let's not lose to China. They're willing to invest in their people, but you don't want to. Here in Congress, we're in the business of helping our fellow Americans, not pulling the rug out from under them. If you're supporting these cuts, you don't believe in the American people. I yield back.
The question's on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Trone. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. And if the gentleman would like a roll call vote, happy to roll that in. Okay. We'll postpone the recorded vote until later in the markup. Are there other amendments at the desk?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady from Vermont, clerk, would you read us out, please, as we distribute the amendment?
Mr. Chair,
Amendment number 13 on rural communities offered by Ms. Ballin.
Ms. Ballant, you have 4 minutes, rather.
thank you. The ballot amendment would restore critical funding to rural communities in line with the deal we reached earlier this year. I'm deeply frustrated that rather than fund the government at the levels that we agreed to on a bipartisan basis just a few months ago, Republicans are determined to force deeper cuts that would directly impact rural America. A deal is a deal, and we have it in writing. And as I said earlier, but I think it bears repeating, 15 members of the committee on the Republican side supported that deal. It's like an SNL skit. You can't believe it when you're saying it, but it's true. It's absolutely true. And I'm here standing up for Vermont, which is an overwhelmingly rural state. And I want to highlight the House Republican vision for rural America. Their appropriations bills would cut nearly $100 million to the Reconnect program, which has already delivered high-speed internet to nearly 400,000 households in rural America. It would cut 30% to the Rural Homes Loan Program, which would mean thousands of families in rural America would not be able to get a loan to afford a home. It would cut $500 million to the Rural Energy for America program. This would raise energy costs for approximately 15,000 rural small businesses and agriculture producers. It would cut $564 million to the Lead Hazard Control and Healthy Homes Grant programs, which remediates health hazards like lead-based paint in low-income housing. This will result in approximately 46,000 children continuing to be exposed to lead-based paint hazards. These are cuts that are unacceptable to rural America. I don't understand why Republicans are going after rural America when they've already been kicked to the curb. I do not understand that. When I'm home in Vermont, constituents come up to me routinely at the grocery store, at the post office, downtown at the bank, and what they say is, we don't want you to cut programs that are helping us. In fact, in the midst of this critical emergency in Vermont right now, we should be fully funding FEMA. We should be making sure that people can recover from disasters. It is unacceptable and outrageous that the Republicans are reneging on a deal that we struck to avoid a catastrophic default. Here we are just a few months later at the brink once again, and as my colleague said, it's gonna cost money, a lot of money, to default. So the argument that somehow this is saving us money is absurd. It's ridiculous. So I urge adoption of my amendment. I wish that we could come to some bipartisan agreement and concern and stand up for rural America. It is really hurting right now. It needs our support. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady from Vermont and open the floor up for anyone who would like to claim opposition to the amendment. I yield to my friend from Oklahoma, Mr. Burkeen,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
for 5 minutes.
Nothing specifically in this budget cuts, reforms, or provides reductions specifically to Function 450, the community and regional development areas that are being discussed. It's absolutely certain that rural communities have been greatly impacted by this administration. We know that since the time that this administration took office, the average family of 4 is spending 15% more to buy the exact same goods and services as they were at the head of January of 2021. The average family of 4 spending $1,100 more per month to buy the exact same goods and services. That equates to about $14,000 over the course of a year. Specifically, if you look at the 36% increase in energy prices, coupled with the 15% general inflation, then you really get a good picture of rural America. I grew up ranching. I still ranch. And it's amazing when you talk to people, what is their biggest issue with what the federal government's doing or not doing? It's the fact that you can't buy a feed truck for what you could just a few years ago. You can't buy a cake box. You can't buy a feed to fill up a overhead feed bin. It'll cost you almost twice. I was just curious. I wanted to see what good 4-point barbed wire would cost right now compared to what I bought it a few years ago. It's about twice what it was several years ago. And so if you want to know what the average person in rural America is dealing with, it is inflation that is driven by devaluation of our currency because of runaway federal spending. So if you really want to help rural America, get serious about reining in this out-of-control spending addiction. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent to submit for the record, a House Budget Memorandum of August 2023 about the CPI report.
Without objection, so ordered.
And that you'll find, the true expense that I kind of mentioned. Specific to agriculture, there's a 23% in just 2 years increase specific to agriculture, inflationary cost. I kind of cited some things a minute ago that I can tell you from being in the agricultural industry. And on that front, Mr. Chairman, I'd also ask unanimous consent to submit data from the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank on interest rates for business into the record. The cost of borrowing, in addition to all of the inflation, direct inflation, the non-direct costs of interest rates climbing because of this out-of-control spending. That is entitled the Kansas City Federal Reserve Bank Interest Rates Last 18 Months. I'd ask unanimous consent to submit that to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And let me just say that in closing, we want to turn around the hardship on families, farmers, ranchers. Let's get serious about not only helping them directly in what's now and present, but also for their kids and their grandkids, who many people are getting out of the agricultural sector because input costs are so high. And I'm seeing it, and that's the reality of what's happening in rural America. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield the balance of my time.
Thank the gentleman from Oklahoma. Rep. Ballant, you have 1 minute to close.
Thank you. What I want to say is this. I feel like we sit in these committees and we're constantly exposed to a Republican sleight of hand. They make drastic, extreme cuts, and then when we try to hold them accountable as to what that will actually mean for Americans, it's always, well, no, it's not going to impact those people. It's not going to impact those people. And no, it's not going to touch that program. But the money has to come from somewhere. The money has to come from somewhere. So I'm done with the sleight of hand. I call on my colleagues to really put aside this partisan sham and come together to help the people who are most in need of that help. I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank the gentlelady. The question is on agreeing to the amendment offered by Ms. Ballant. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. If you
Request recorded vote.
we will postpone the recorded vote until later in the markup per our agreement. Are there any other amendments?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have what is our final amendment, what I believe is our final amendment, unless there are any other members on the Republican side who have one.
I think we've come to the final amendment. This would be Amendment 15. And if the gentleman will hold, we'll have the clerk report, we'll circulate the amendment, and then you can proceed.
Amendment 15 on the debt ceiling offered by Ranking Member Boyle.
I yield 4 minutes to my friend and colleague from Pennsylvania, Rep. Boyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know the way that these have been going so far, the previous 14, all Democratic members voting one way, all Republican members voting against. What I really hope is this is being passed out. It's a quick read, all of about 6 or 7 sentences. This is an amendment that builds on an idea that already has bipartisan support. It is about the need to reform the way in which we raise the debt ceiling. To be clear, this does not eliminate the debt ceiling. It simply endorses the idea that we need to reform the way in which we raise it. Because this constant brinksmanship over the last dozen years or so does us no good only has real harm, and potentially, if at one point we would go over the cliff, would have catastrophic harm. So I have a specific bill that is not reflected in this amendment, which is called the Debt Ceiling Reform Act. It essentially takes an idea that Mitch McConnell had from 2011, which existed for 2 years, and makes it permanent. Our chairman, Jodey Arrington, as well as Mr. Peters, have their own debt ceiling reform idea, which also I think has real merit. And I believe there are other members out there as well with their own proposals. So look, we continue to tempt fate the longer we go with these constant destructive showdowns over the debt ceiling. And that was dramatic. That was, I didn't mean to shock you into, we already have, even though we haven't gone over the cliff yet, we see a real financial cost already. Chairman brought up before the downgrade that we got from Fitch's. The very first thing they cited was the brinksmanship over the debt ceiling and the potential that it not be raised in time. That followed on the heels of the Standard & Poor's downgrade that we received during the 2011 debt ceiling debacle. This issue will be back front and center again in January in 2025. And just think, part of the reason why the House of Representatives is greatly behind in its work and the Senate this year on appropriations bills is because the first 5 months were taken up entirely by the debt ceiling issue. So the policy, and I'll read it verbatim, it is the policy of this resolution that Congress must reform the debt ceiling by making changes in the law that would remove the threat of catastrophic default and ongoing manufacturer crises. I am hopeful that people would consider supporting this amendment, and more importantly, that we will, over the course of the next year, work together to identify a smarter, bipartisan solution to the way in which we raise the debt ceiling, because what we're doing now, I think we could get bipartisan agreement in this, what we're doing right now is a mess as it relates to the debt ceiling. It's costly, and potentially it could be very destructive to us all. With that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Pennsylvania and ask if there is any opposition to the amendment. I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from South Carolina, and I know there are others that would like to comment as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I find it interesting that having debate on something as serious as a debt ceiling is a problem. The fact that we're having the debate on something that could sink this country, we need to have more debate on it. And to take the debt ceiling off totally, I can't see I don't understand that type reasoning. Mr. Trone had an interesting comment that he's a successful businessman, you borrowed money. I borrow money. I'm in the business arena. The difference is I have to pay it back. I think you have to pay it back. All of us, unless, really, even if you have family money, you got to pay it back. So that's where we are right now. And we're just not paying it back, and it's gotten to a sustained level that we can't sustain. Now, a little history, the debt ceiling has been raised 78 times since it was first used in the 20th century. Because of the debate, government spending has been curtailed. None of these fights have led to a default on the national debt. Letting it go unchecked is, totally out of, I guess, reality.
You have a request for the gentleman to yield. Do you?
Not right now.
Okay.
I'm going to finish this. The fact that savings in government spending have been directly attributed to recent debt ceiling fights. This includes, I think we had $2 trillion in deficit reduction from each of the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023 and the Budget Control Act of 2021. Chairman Arrington, I ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record an article from the Brookings Institute, Fiscal Fights of the Obama Administration, and an article from the Committee for Fiscal Responsibility about entitled, How Much the Fiscal Responsibility Act Would Save.
Without objection, so ordered.
And And lastly, I would say that the fact that this has been downgraded by Fitch is not a figment of our imagination. Both agencies, S&P and Fitch, downgraded the U.S. debt due to a lack of medium-term fiscal framework, which we're doing right now with what we're presenting. It's just that if you want to cause this country to go into a complete tailspin, keep spending and not paying it back, as it would any business or any family that tries to run on a budget, which all of us do. I also ask for unanimous consent to submit for the record an article from Fitch titled "Fitch Downgrades." Bottom line,
Without objection, so ordered.
bottom line, eliminate the debt ceiling would take away a tool that we have to open up the conversation. And if you wanted to avoid a default, pay the debt off. And there's no better time to do that than now. I want to yield a minute to my good friend Lloyd from Texas.
Well, that's the highest compliment he's ever been paid.
I knew he would say
Yeah, he's Texas, yeah.
That's even worse than the other stuff you were saying.
So I understand the ranking member's intent here. You know, it does get messy, but for me, it's the only time when there's a forcing mechanism for us to talk about the debt. And I think you and I, all of us agree that the debt is a real problem. So so I'm opposed to doing away with it unless we have something better. And I think we should come up with something better. For instance, why don't we limit the debt to GDP and have that decline over a period of time? Or why don't we limit expenditures to some percentage of GDP and have that decline over time? And we know the trouble we're in going forward. We could have this it could be a real check. Switzerland, for instance, I think back in the early 2000s did what they called a debt break. Which required in their case, they have a balanced budget amendment, so it's a little different than our situation, but it required their debt to somehow relate back to the revenue over the past few years, and it's worked very, very effectively. So the only point I'm making is, I understand what you're saying, but I think we need some mechanism to require us to have the discussion, and even better, to require us to live within our means. And you know, our debt to GDP is very high now, projected to grow. Let's find a pathway to take that down over a period of time, and we could replace then the debt ceiling with something like that forces us to do that.
The gentleman yield?
Would you yield?
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you for yielding.
Let me just ask this. By any metric, has the 435 members of both parties done a service for the American people? By any metric you use, is running up a $32 trillion debt, is that doing a good job? If you lost that, a fraction of that in your business, is that doing a good job? No, you'd be fired, and you should be. I yield back.
Mr. Boyle, you get the last word and yield to my ranking member 1 minute for closing.
Yeah, so I want to respond to a couple of things that were said here. But first, I know Mr. Blumenauer was trying to be recognized when Mr. Norman was speaking, so I want to yield him 15 seconds so he has an opportunity.
I just wanted to say, we always have paid off our debt. What freaked people out is the specter that we would default for the first time in American history. We haven't done that, and we're not going to do that if we can get back on track.
You yield to, yeah. Well, thank you. Let me say a couple points. First, there seems to be, again, and it's right in front of us, only about 6 or 7 sentences, there seems to be a misconception about this amendment. This amendment does not remove the debt ceiling. What it does commit ourselves to is exactly what Mr. Smucker was talking about, a better mechanism, a less messy, less costly mechanism by which we raise the debt ceiling. It could potentially have in there a mechanism that forces us in a more constructive way to deal with our debt. That is something actually that's in one of the reform proposals that Mr. Arrington and Mr. Peters have. I also say to Mr. Norman, your statement is not consistent with itself. On the one hand, you said that our $32 trillion debt, it's unsustainable, but then also, by the way, we've raised the debt ceiling 78 times, and that's the only reason why we're curtailing our debt. Both of those things can't be the case. If we have a debt that's too high, then I would say it's self-evident using this as a mechanism to curtail debt has failed, and has failed spectacularly. So it's only over the last dozen years or so, though, that we have had these very scary, very dangerous debacles in terms of threatening to actually not raise the debt ceiling. In other words, renege on our debt and renege on our obligations. That did not happen. If you try to go back and say, geez, how did President Kennedy deal with this, or President Nixon, or President Reagan, or President Bush, it didn't happen. It has been, unfortunately, a function of the sort of, I would say, decline in the sort of norms here in Congress that have only really developed over the last 20 years. So we have time now. Before January 2025 is in front of us and we're once again dealing with the debt ceiling issue for months and months, let's take this time now to commit ourselves to coming up with an intelligent, bipartisan reform to the debt ceiling that addresses our long-term debt issues in a responsible way, but also takes away the specter of all of us together going off and over that cliff. I yield back.
If I may, Ranking Member, we have agreed to kick off, and we'll spend more time now that we have worked through this in this committee. We'll have to take it beyond that. That will be of interest to us, probably not as much to you all. We need to spend time because we've agreed that this process is failing from soup to nuts, right? Like, we don't do this enough. I appreciate the thoughtfulness on both sides. We don't have the debate. We don't get budgets out. We don't live by budgets. We waive rules. I mean, the Republicans have waived the spending caps that we fought hard for in 2010. And then we waived them, I know, as a freshman in 2017. And I just thought, where is the party of fiscal responsibility? On either side, period. So I think this idea is thoughtful, and I think we have to work together to identify a system that holds us all accountable and forces us ultimately to not push this payment of this government on our children. How we do that? I know there's tax considerations on one side, revenue, and there's a belief that our spending is what's running away and driving it. At some point, the option cannot be, though, the default to having our children paying it. And that's, my friends, what's going to happen at this point if things get sideways, and they're already starting to turn, in my opinion. Last word.
Yeah, thank you. And as we've, hope you don't mind me saying this publicly, as we've talked throughout this hearing.
As long as you don't commit me to this amendment.
No. As we were saying privately, this has been an exchange throughout today that we've both enjoyed, very substantive. We have kicked off on a bipartisan basis already the beginning of our effort to try to identify bipartisan reforms to the overall budget process to improve it, because it has broken down more times than it has succeeded in the 49 years it's been in existence, especially over the last 20. And so having the debt ceiling conversation as part of that overall reform effort, I think we both agree is certainly necessary.
I thank my friend and call the question on agreeing to the amendment offered by Mr. Boyle. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All those no.
No.
In my opinion, and it has been my opinion all day, that the noes have it.
For such a young man, I'm concerned about your hearing sometimes, Jody, on some of those votes.
Well, if you'd like a recorded vote,
Yeah,
we will roll
request
them
a
all
recorded
in
vote, yes.
before this markup's over. And now, I again appreciate everybody working through these amendments. Great discussion. Without objection, the committee will now vote en bloc.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I ask to be recognized.
I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina.
I move the committee.
I reclaim the time, and without objection, the committee will now vote en bloc, as I mentioned before, on all postponed votes, all 15 amendments considered. The clerk, if you would, call the roll, please.
Mr. Norman.
No. Let's.
Mr. Norman, no.
He said,
Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock, no. Mr. Grothman. Mr. Grothman, no. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, no. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, no. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, no. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, no. Mr. Bergman. No. Mr. Bergman, no. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, no. Mr. Roy. No. Mr. Roy, no. Mr. Moore. No. Mr. Moore, no. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Estes. No. Mr. Estes, no. Miss Bice. Miss Bice, no. Miss McLean. No. Miss McLean, no. Miss Fishbach. No. Miss Fishbach, no. Mr. Yocum. No. Mr. Yocum, no. Mr. Brackeen.
No.
Mr. Brackeen, no. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, no. Mr. Boyle.
Aye.
Mr. Boyle, aye. Mr. Higgins.
yes.
Mr. Higgins, aye. Ms. Schakowsky.
Aye.
Ms. Schakowsky, aye. Mr. Blumenauer.
Aye.
Mr. Blumenauer, aye. Mr. Kildee. Aye. Mr. Kildee, aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, aye. Miss Lee. Miss Lee. Mr. Blumenauer, or Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, aye. Mr. Panetta. Aye. Mr. Panetta, aye. Miss Wexton. Aye. Miss Wexton, aye. Miss Jackson Lee. Miss Jackson Lee. Miss Omar.
Aye.
Miss Omar, aye. Mr. Trone.
Aye.
Mr. Trone, aye. Miss Ballant.
Aye.
Miss Ballant, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Espaillat. Mr. Espaillat, aye. Mr. Chair, the gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Carter, no. Mr. Chairman.
Arrington's a no.
Mr. Chairman, no.
If there are no further amendments, I recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Ralph Norman. Okay, I don't recognize Mr. Norman. I mean, I recognize him. I think that's him. And by the way, I think he was going to say, I am a no. And I apologize for cutting you off. Are there any members who wish to vote? Question mark. If not, the clerk shall report, period.
Mr.
Clerk?
Chair, on the vote, there were 14 ayes and 20 nays.
The noes have it. The amendments are not agreed to. Now, if there are no further amendments, I'd like to recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee adopt the budget aggregates, the functional categories, and other appropriate matters.
Questions on the adoption of the budget aggregates, functional categories, and other appropriate matters? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Norman.
Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee on the budget order the concurrent resolution and the budget reported to the House with a recommendation that the resolution be adopted.
Pursuant to Committee Rule 10, I now call up the text of the concurrent resolution on the budget. It is identical to what was distributed yesterday. Legislative text incorporates the budget aggregates, functional levels, and all other relevant items as previously agreed to. I recognize again Mr. Norman.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on the Budget order the concurrent resolution on the budget reported to the House with a recommendation that the resolution be adopted.
Question is on ordering the concurrent resolution on the budget to be favorably reported to the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
In the
Mr.
opinion-
Chairman, request recorded vote.
You bet. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. A roll call vote is requested. The clerk, will you please call the roll?
Mr. Norman. Aye. Mr. Norman, aye. Mr. McClintock. Aye. Mr. McClintock, aye. Mr. Grothman. Aye. Mr. Grothman, aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Carter. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein, aye. Mr. Good. Mr. Good, aye. Mr. Bergman. Mr. Bergman, aye. Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Ferguson, aye. Mr. Roy. Aye. Mr. Roy, aye. Mr. Moore.
I am an aye.
Mr. Moore, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Valadeo. Mr. Estes. Mr. Estes, aye. Miss Bice. Miss Bice, aye. Miss McLean. Miss McLean, aye. Miss Fishbach. Miss Fishbach, aye. Mr. Yocum. Mr. Yocum, aye. Mr. Burkeen. Mr. Burkeen, aye. Mr. Edwards. Mr. Edwards, aye. Mr. Boyle.
No.
Mr. Boyle, no. Mr. Higgins.
No.
Mr. Higgins, no. Ms. Schakowsky.
No.
Ms. Schakowsky, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kildee. No. Mr. Kildee, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Miss Lee. Miss Lee. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Panetta. Mr. Panetta, no. Miss Wexton. Miss Wexton, no. Miss Jackson Lee. Miss Jackson Lee. Miss Omar. Miss Omar, no. Mr. Trone. No. Mr. Trone, no. Miss Ballant. Miss Ballant, no. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, no. Mr. Espaillat. No. Mr. Espaillat, no. Mr. Chairman.
I'm a yes.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Are there any members who wish to vote? If not, the clerk shall report.
Mr. Chair, on the vote, there were 20 ayes and 14 nays.
The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The concurrent resolution on the budget, reverse the curse, for fiscal year 2024 is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. I note for the record that a quorum is present. I'd like to ask members to remain for a few more minutes for a series of perfunctory motions. Without objection, pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 22 of the Rules of the House, the chair shall be authorized to offer such motions in the House as may be necessary to go to the conference with the Senate on a concurrent resolution on the budget for fiscal year 2024,
Just speak up.
and that staff be authorized to make technical and conforming corrections and to calculate the remaining elements required in the resolution prior to the filing of the resolution.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for the requisite number of days to submit minority views.
Without objection. Well, that concludes today's business of the House Budget Committee. The committee now stands adjourned.